Good evening, everyone. Um, yeah, I'm Steve Bunbadgee, Hodder. Um, I guess to start off, I'll pay respects to um, the custodians of the land, the Gadigal people from the Aorta Nation, and I suppose I pay credit to Sticks as well for getting us down here. Sort of roped in a bit last minute to stand in for some other recognised people who couldn't make it down for various reasons. Um, I guess first of all, just to explain how I ended up in Mbandwa, Alice Springs as well. I've got a English-born mother who emigrated over here back in the 60s. She campaigned with Aboriginal Justice League down in Victoria, and my father was a Lardle man, and he was also a founding member of the Mornington Island Dancers, who are one of the premier traditional Aboriginal dance troupes, toured around the country sharing Aboriginal culture. And so Mum, I guess, fell in love with that culture when she saw it in Melbourne and followed all the dancers back up to Mornington. She worked at the council there and was there in the Joe Bjelke-Petersen era when they had the Shires take over there. Got kicked off the island, I think, and then ended up going back afterwards. And 1977, out came a couple of little brown boys. She moved us to Cairns in about a few years later when we were about 3 years old. I guess, we sort of look at that question now about, it was not a forced removal, but having to sort of sacrifice that connection to your country to be able to try and get a bit more of mainstream education. And so Mum, I guess, had to make that decision, and so that sacrifice came about. And then for some reason, I think she fell in love with the desert, and so we moved there to Alice Springs in 1986. Originally, she worked for Pine Gap, can you believe it? But that didn't last long. She ended up campaigning against the base and standing in front of the fences where where she used to work inside of. So she'd worked with Aboriginal organisations like Tangentyere Council in Alice Springs. That's the auspicing and municipal services body that provides those services to the town camps around Alice Springs. So I don't know if you know much about how the town camps work, but yeah, pretty much the settlements on the edges of town when people weren't allowed to come in to the centres, and also when they had curfews in place, so people had to get out of town. They didn't have any services. People like Barbara Shaw, who's campaigned heavily against the intervention from day one back in 2007. Mum works alongside her with coordinating in that administration. Her father would go around with a few other Aboriginal fellows, Aranda men, and also outlying communities, and they'd just drive around and get buckets of water, take buckets of water to people. Tangentyere Council built up from there. Now they've got some 12 town camps around, and they represent virtually all of the tribal groups from, you're talking about maybe 500,000 square kilometres, something like that, all the regions that come in. So that's a bit of the story of Tangentyere, but Mum worked for them. She also worked out at Utopia, where Rosalie Kunoth Monks and Amelia, who's also come down as well, are from. We spent 6 months growing up there, and Yeah, same again. Talking about places where it actually takes you an hour or two to go and get, when you're talking about going to the shop. If you're at Three Boars, it's 60, 70 kilometres to go to Alburra, which is, news store where the store is, and all the services like the Shire Council, the police station that Amelia talked about that cost $8 million and houses 2 police officers. And Mum also worked down on the APY lands, the Anangu Pitjantjatjara lands, Yankunytjatjara lands, just in northern South Australia. They've got, I think they've got some issues as well with how they're dealing with some of these measures that came about, which have continued on from the implementation of the Northern Territory Emergency Response and the anti-intervention. So if we go into that, I think a big part of how that came about really obviously happened through the media. You had the Four Corners report, which talked to Nanette Rogers, who was the Chief Justice in the Northern Territory, and detailed the worst cases of child abuse. And of course, when you highlight that, it looks like that's widespread across the board. So it really sort of set the scene for, I guess, that continuation of characterising the Aboriginal communities as these sort of destitute places where a lot of horrible things occur, and perpetuate that myth that Aboriginal people need to be saved by the white man again. And likewise with the Late Line story on Mutijulu, Mutijulu being the Aboriginal community at the base of Uluru. There was a Late Line story that Tony Jones hosted, and I think he featured a hidden, unknown youth worker from Mutijulu, who turned out to be one of Malbrough's staffers. And I was in Mutijulu a couple of weeks ago doing a story with NITV, doing camera for the story on NITV, talking about the 10th anniversary of the intervention, and traditional owners of Uluru like Sammy Wilson, Jama, and young leaders like Craig Woods. They all still feel the pain of that, and actually told us that he's still actually working. That same guy is actually working down near the pitlands again on Anangu country, and they're not too happy about it either. So as far as that goes, I mean, being in media, Aboriginal media, when I was a community broadcaster with Karma, you get to watch how people are portrayed, and having these people in unknown places like Sydney, so far away, talking about communities that they don't really understand and they don't really know, sort of brings home, how far we might not have come, and how much we can sort of, history keeps repeating itself. It feels like we're coming back around again to maybe another movement again where the oppressed, the marginalised, the disempowered have to start, really joining forces and campaigning to push harder against those who are actually profiting off that demonisation and marginalisation. As far as when the intervention started, even personally, even though I don't live in one of the communities or the town camps, which the government labelled as prescribed areas, so I don't have to, I don't live under that oppression as much as those as the countrymen there do. Even so, when they talked about health checks for all Aboriginal children, Tony Abbott was health minister then, if you can believe they gave him that job. And yeah, so he came on TV and he's, does his big walk up, and then he's talking about every single Aboriginal child in the Northern Territory getting health checks to see if they've been sexually abused. Hey? Rose Bay, yeah. So that hit home for me because I'm sort of I guess I live a bit more mainstream lifestyle, but it didn't matter whether you lived on the town camps or not. When you hear him say that it's targeting everyone's children, no matter where they live, just because they are Aboriginal, meant that you were targeting my 9-year-old daughter at the time. You're targeting my 3-year-old son at the time, so that really hit home for me. Obviously, the AMA, the doctors shut that one down pretty quick as far as doing the sexual health checks. But that demonisation, that racism, the segregation, the intervention brought in, that attitude. I guess that was always there in a way. Alice Springs is pretty sort of cross-cultural coalface in a way where you get this mix of people and yet it doesn't feel like there's as much unity and collaboration as there could be. You've got like shopping centres named after the Aboriginal dream in Yipperinya. You've got streets called Aknulla using Aranda words, and yet they won't even fly the Aboriginal flag on the Anzac Monument or whatever, which is actually on another sacred site as well. But yeah, that demonisation, it really gave license to that apartheid style attitude towards that supremacy, thinking that these people can be looked down on. I remember going to one of the shops, the big supermarkets, and an old lady was I think she was looking through the bins. I don't know if she was looking for bottles or something, and I think I was just walking in, and these guys had walked out, non-Indigenous obviously, and sort of yelled at her, "Get out!" like she's a dog or something. It's like, what right have you got to tell people what to do? When it just it really hurt to see that happen, and brought home that things weren't as good as they could be. And I mean, people get desensitized to it. You've got police standing out the front of supermarkets checking identification of Aboriginal people to see where they live, because when you go into the bottle shop or if you're going to purchase alcohol, you can't drink it on the prescribed areas, so you can't take it back to the town camps or on the communities. And even maybe a week or two ago, we went to the east side shops, and I went inside, and while I was inside, my brother told me when I came out that a young couple, Aboriginal couple, had come out of the store, had purchased alcohol, come out of the store. A police officer had pulled them up, asked for identification. They couldn't supply it, and so he confiscated their alcohol. He didn't tip it out, he just confiscated it. So, yeah. And so, yeah, he must have had a good time. But I mean, it sort of it raises those questions. I mean, where's your consumer rights there? Why don't you take the bottle back and get the refund and give them their money back? Why wasn't he actually doing his job and asking for the ID before? I mean, that's a territory legislation now, but that sort of attitude was brought in. They did have the BDR system, which is the banned drinkers registry, where you actually check everyone who goes into a bottle shop has to have their license scanned, their ID scanned, so to compare if you're on a no drink list, I guess. But back to the intervention as well. Even the Little Children Are Sacred report, which I guess was the original precursor to the intervention, that how many of the recommendations were picked up from that, even though Howard used that as the reasoning or excuse for starting the intervention. In there alone, one of the stats is on housing. I think there were around 500 or 600 houses done during the time of the intervention under the CHIP program. The report, which they based the whole regime on, called for 4,000 to start off with, and then even more every year from that. So the income management, people on basics cards. While at Karma, we were going down to report and document people picketing Woolworths and supermarkets because they were having segregated lines where obviously only people with the basics cards, but obviously they were all Aboriginal. And then, the stigmatisation again, people standing in line not knowing how much money they've got on this card because it's not a key card, it's this special ration card. People not knowing how much money they've got on it, and then other customers rolling their eyes and going, oh, these bloody black people, whatever. And I mean, even that system, when you think about what was the basis then if this isn't about child protection, with the statistics now, you can see that it obviously failed in those areas as well. What was the real reasoning behind it then? And you can see income management being rolled out across the country now, targeting the poor in other areas. I think they've got it costing now around $1 billion to administer that. That's just the administration, the fees on that, not even the money that they're using for those funds. And I remember we went down the year after it started, the day before the apology to the stolen generations. We had a big convergence in Canberra of Aboriginal groups from right around the country. And there was a delegation from Central Australia that bussed all the way from Alice Springs to Canberra, about 40 leaders, bit of a who's who back then of, the cultural and political leadership from that region. And they went down to lobby some of the politicians and government. And we also had a protest action there on the Parliament lawns the day before the apology. And back then I did a speech which was just published on NITV online yesterday as well, I think, too. And I sort of did it a bit spoken word, so tried to chuck in some rhymes, but it was chucked together pretty quick, so just as a response and sort of trying to, I guess, share or pick up on some of what I'd got from my observations. I think there was a wish list I did at the end, and I sort of look on it now that two of those things that I thought they'd already picked up, reinstating the Racial Discrimination Act. They brought that back in because they'd suspended that to be able to bring in all the measures. And the only reasoning, what is the legal definitions they can use to be able to suspend the Racial Discrimination Act is to claim that it's for the benefit of Aboriginal people. And yet you've got 500 pages of legislation passing through Senate like nothing by a bunch of white people, which is targeting a specific racial group in the community. So that was that was pretty full on. So even reinstating the Racial Discrimination Act doesn't actually change the fact of them targeting specific groups, namely because of race. Also, the second wish that I had on my list was about implementing the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People. I think Australia is a signatory to that now, but hasn't actually enshrined that to provide those protections for Aboriginal people or Indigenous peoples in Australia yet. So I don't know. Don't ask me about the referendum council or constitutional recognition debate. I'll leave that one for now. And the third was obviously repealing the Northern Territory, or the National Northern Territory Emergency Response legislation, because it's still continuing today. I think was it Olga Havnen called for, and she said she wanted her own intervention now, but to be led by Aboriginal people. So I think if we're looking at how we want to try to repair the damage or to heal that wound, then it's got to start by putting that autonomy back into the grassroots communities who have all the knowledge and the understanding and the investment. They have their whole beings invested in their communities. So who would you rather trust to be able to take care of the communities? You know, an Aboriginal person who has their whole identity based on their community, or a white bureaucrat in Canberra. I think I'll leave it there for now. Thank you.